Today's discourse um, was given by Reverend Tara, and the topic is the next step. For people who are familiar with the Bible, there is a passage from the Old Testament in Ecclesiastes. And if you want to look it up, it's in chapter 3. But this section of Ecclesiastes is about cycles and about time. And I know there's a famous song that borrows from this passage, which is escaping me at the moment, but it's a famous song from the 60s. I think Turn, Turn, Turn. That's it. But anyway, it's essentially saying there's a time for everything in this universe. So, as examples, a time for birth and a time for death, a time for peace and a time for war, a time for breaking down and building up, and so on and so on. It's a pretty long passage. So I bring up Ecclesiastes because it's talking about cycles and it's talking about next steps. And when you think to yourself about the next step, there's a lot of different things that can come to mind. And when you think about next steps, you can come from a point of individuality or from a more globally conscious viewpoint. So what I'd like everybody to do is, when I brought up the subject of today's discourse being the next step, think about what your initial thought was about that discourse and the subject. And were you coming from an individual perspective? So from what was your next step going to be versus a more universal consciousness of what was the next or is the next step going to be for humanity. And when you think about where your mind was at that point, that will help guide you in terms of where you are in consciousness. And if you would like to make a change from that viewpoint, then you are able to do that. Part of cycles and changes are evolutionary. And when I was contemplating today's discourse and thinking about evolution, for some people in some religious traditions, evolution has a particular, well, I guess I would call it a negative connotation. And at this point, what I'm talking about in terms of evolution is Darwin. So Darwin's theory of evolution, as many of us know, that's about 160 years old at this point. And when it initially came out, there was a lot of pushback. For people who know their history in America anyway, a lot of the pushback was from the Christian traditions. And the pushback dealt in part with the fact that they didn't believe Darwinism aligned with the story of creation as that story was told in the Bible. But it's not just Christians. I happened to look this up this morning. I was wondering if you compare different religious traditions, which ones were more accepting of the theory of evolution versus which ones weren't. And Buddhists tend to be pretty accepting. The Jewish tradition is pretty accepting, which was somewhat surprising to me, given the creation story. It comes from the Buddhist text in the Old Testament. And then it goes less so when you get to Muslims and Christians of different traditions, Protestant versus Catholic, and so on, Jehovah's Witnesses. So why am I bringing up Darwinism and evolution? Because evolution is part of our next step. We are all evolving back to the Godhead. So as we like to say here at the Spirit of Lotus, we're not humans having a spiritual experience during this life. We're actually spirit having a human experience. So we all come from spirit, and at some point we are all going to return to spirit. We're going to evolve back to our true nature. And the way that we are evolving now is, now this doesn't of course apply to everybody, but as a general rule, humanity is becoming more and more globally conscious, more and more unity conscious. Just stepping back to a second to talk about Darwinism, really at its essence, Darwin was saying that everything is connected on this entire planet. We are all interconnected. And more complex forms of life come from lower forms of life in an evolutionary process over time. And because we are all so connected and we are all evolving, and by we, I mean everything is evolving. Humans, insects, reptiles, water, air, everything is changing and evolving. And we are coming to a point in this evolution where either we accept this evolutionary process and evolve with it, or we don't accept it and are left behind and are laggards. The fact of the matter is, our world construct for each individual is based on what you think and what you believe. And this is true because we are co-creators with God, every single one of us. Whether you accept that or not, it is a truism. And so we are all individually creating our own reality. And we teach here that the mind is the link between spirit, which is the unmanifest, which is the all possibility, and the reality around you. So the way the teaching goes, it's spirit into mind and mind into matter. So the mind is that connection. Whatever you think is. And not only is this accepted among most mystic spiritual traditions, but psychologists have actually studied this. And the way they studied it is, if, let's take for example, you think that people ignore you in the world. Because you have that thought and that belief, what people tend to do is look for support of that belief, for justification of that belief, for evidence of that belief around them. So they look at people around them for evidence that people around them are ignoring them to support their worldview. And we all do this, according to psychologists. And the only way to change the reality around you, if you buy into the concept that your mind is the link between spirit and all possibility and the physical reality, is to what? You have to change the way you think. So if you want to enter into a more global consciousness or universal consciousness or unity consciousness or whatever phrase you want to attach to that, you have to change your thinking from an I, me, my thinking to a we, our, us thinking. To make your thinking more universal, to make your thinking more global. And once you do that, once you change the manner of your thinking, you will see that the environment around you will change. It will, in effect, evolve with the evolution of your thinking. There is a little story from Buddhism that I wanted to share, because this ties into this, what we're talking about right now. A lot of us are, in terms of our thinking, we are tied to questions that we cannot answer, or some of us can't answer. So for instance, are we eternal beings? Are we spirit? If we are spirit, what does our spiritual body look like? Is there life after death? This Buddhist story teaches us that focusing on questions like that really doesn't help us in terms of our evolution to enlightenment during this lifetime. And so the story, it's about a man who is shot by a poisoned arrow. So this man's on the battlefield and he's shot, and the poisoned arrow is stuck in his chest. If this man thought about certain questions like, who shot the arrow? Was the person who shot the arrow using a crossbow or a longbow or a short bow? Was it, a white person or a black person or an Asian person? Was it a male or a female? How old were they? What were they wearing? How far away were they? In the end, what does that do for the man who has the poisoned arrow stuck in his chest? Nothing really. What he needs to do is take out the poisoned arrow and get treatment. All of those questions, although I'm not saying it's a bad thing to consider those questions, they're not helping you evolve or move forward. So we have to change our mindset. And humanity is already doing this. When I say we're becoming more globally conscious, and that is the next step for us, this is happening over time, whether we want it to or not. We started to become connected thousands of years ago when we built roads, right? One of the greatest things the Romans ever did was what? Build roads. They constructed roads linking their towns and their cities together, making them more connected. In addition to roads, ships started traveling from port to port, making us more connected. And it goes on and on and on. We developed cars and airplanes and the telephone, and now we have cell phones and the internet, and we are becoming more and more connected. And I would postulate that as we evolve, we are going to reach a point where we are putting down these tools which we don't actually really need. What do I mean by that? We're going to come to a point where we'll be able to read each other's thoughts. We're going to be connected in that fashion. We can already do this. Our own minds limit us. We have stuck ourselves in boxes of limitation saying we cannot do certain things. Again, this is the mind link, and therefore we cannot. But these boxes are opening, and we are becoming more universal. We won't need cell phones and the internet or anything else to be able to reach each other, be with each other in thought, in body, in spirit. And all of this is returning us back to spirit and back to where we came from with God. I mentioned a little bit earlier about laggards. Not everybody is going to accept this change, this inevitable change, this inevitable part of evolution. And they're going to hold on to, with a tight grasp, their old ways and old stories and old traditions, and they're not going to let go. And they will be left behind, and that's why they will be laggards. It's like evolution and spirit is like a free-flowing river. If you put blocks in that river, and blocks would be things like attachment to the past, attachment to the future, you're damming the free flow. You're damming the river. And when you dam the river, what happens to the river? It stops flowing, and depending on how you dam it, it becomes stagnant. Things die in it. It becomes polluted because you're not flowing with things as they are progressing, as they are meant to progress. So the whole discourse this morning um, was trying to impart the concept that by changing the way we think, by realizing that we are all united. It doesn't matter if you're a male or a female, if you're young or old, if you're white, black, Asian, Mexican, we are all the same. In spirit, we are the same, and we are all connected. There is in reality, no separation between us and another individual, no separation between us and that chair that's in front of me. We are that chair is us. We are everything, and everything is us. I can't remember which one of the ministers was giving this example. It might have been Reverend Tara. Some people talk about each human being a drop in the ocean. But here we view it a little differently. When you take a drop out of the ocean, that drop is the entirety of the ocean. It has all of the ocean within that drop, and that's like an individual human. We have everything contained within us. All possibility is within us. No limitation is within us. And this is where the next step humanity is going. It's slow but sure, and it is inevitable, and hopefully we can all progress with it, because when you adopt this unity consciousness, when you push away separation between other people and other things, when you truly love everyone and everything without exception, without condition, that is when you have truly realized your potential. And so with that, we have some time left over for